Well, good morning. Let me just start by saying that today is a really wonderful time to be in your early 20s and early 30s. If your parents are well-to-do and can pay for your college outright, leaving you with no debt, if they can help out with the rent from time to time and maybe give you a down payment for a home or purchase the home outright on your behalf. Now, in fact, over the last 3 decades, sort of the advantages that accrue, just as a matter of luck of birth, have become so much more powerful and predictive of success. But if your parents aren't well off, it's a different story. For those young people, the majority of young people, it's a story of declining incomes, rising debt, and the frustration that no matter how committed they are to playing by the rules, getting ahead is a pretty elusive state of affairs. And so it is that the legacy of conservatism is going to be to have created the first generation that will not be better off than their parents. Now, what I want to do is, and what I do in my book, is examine how today's 20 and 30-somethings are doing economically compared to how their parents are doing, which really gives you a good look at how conservative prescriptions have been failing people in this economy. Before I get into the specifics, though, I just want to set the broader context. And that is that a generation ago, when sort of the people who are now at the oldest of the baby boomers were starting out, there were several factors in place that sort of eased the transition to adulthood and made it easier for people to either work or educate their way into the middle class. What were those things? Well, we had jobs that paid great wages even if you didn't go to college. We had an economy in which productivity gains were shared by CEOs and workers alike. And then we had a range of public policies that actually facilitated economic mobility and opportunity. Things like a strong minimum wage, low college tuition at state universities, generous grant aid to help low-income students go to college, and a solid safety net for those falling on hard times. Back then, the private sector and public policy worked hand in hand to make a middle-class life possible for lots of Americans. Well, I don't have to tell you that that world no longer exists today. Now, sure, globalization and technological change have fundamentally altered our nation's economy, and some of the blame can be placed there for the new pressures on young workers. But much of the blame can be placed on the failure of public policy to address the changing economy and meet the needs of a new generation. All right, so let's turn to the slides. Let's just look at how young people are doing in terms of their incomes. Here we have the median earnings for workers without a college degree, with just a high school diploma. Now, men's incomes have dropped. These are adjusted for inflation by about 30% compared to a generation ago. Women have done fairly better. They had less of a decline, although a minor one at that. The trends continue when you look at that big chunk of the workforce that today makes up about 1/3 of all workers. With some college, again, we see a pretty steep decline, about 20% for young male workers with some college. Women have fared better, largely by working longer hours and because there are a better array of occupations open to them today. So we know the story here, we've heard it. With the loss of manufacturing jobs have come the loss of good-paying jobs for people without college degrees. All of these jobs have been replaced by a low-wage service sector. But another part of the story here is that we lost our union jobs. And indeed, this is the connection back to the legacy of conservatism, because after decades of anti-union legislation at the state level and sentiment from the highest of our elected officials, it has become a right for workers to organize only on paper, but not in reality. In addition, what we see going on here for young workers and the decline in earnings is attributable to the fact that the minimum wage is at a 50-year low. And all throughout the 90s, even when it was raised, it was still, its purchasing power was still less than it was a generation ago. Now, I just want to quickly show that, and this, Harold, will answer the question about why your daughter has to call you up to hit you up for help every once in a while. College earners young people with college degrees, their incomes over a generation have been pretty flat. Women have done better, again, better choice of occupations, better high-paying jobs opening up to them. And this explains a lot. If even those who should be getting ahead, college degree earners, have flatlined their earnings when you compare it to the previous generation, yet think of all the costs that have outpaced both the growth in incomes and the growth of inflation. Now, the decline in earnings for basically the majority of young people in this generation begs a question. If they're earning a lot less than their parents did at this age, how the heck are they getting along? Well, one main coping mechanism is they're going into a lot of debt. And in fact, based on a survey that Demos did a year ago of low to middle income young people, we surveyed all low and middle income households, but among those under 35, the average amount of credit card debt among those who have credit card debt, which is about 3/4 of the young population, the average debt that they were carrying was around $8,000. Now, why are they in so much debt? Well, it's connected to these larger trends. Just under half said that in the last year, they had used their credit cards to pay for basic living expenses, things like the rent, utilities, and groceries. Now, as Michelle mentioned, this debt comes at a high price thanks to deregulation of the lending industry. Contrary to sort of the promises that were made by the champions of deregulation, the cost of credit for those who actually borrow and revolve each month has gotten much, much higher. We've seen a proliferation of high-cost products like payday loans, where the typical interest rate is 400% APR. So essentially what we have here is, in the absence of a public safety net, we've created a new plastic safety net. And that is largely how many young workers today are filling the gap between their earnings and their costs. So, continuing with the debt theme, I want to move on to higher and higher education. Now, up until the 1980s, our government did a pretty good job of making college affordable. Federal financial aid was oriented towards those that couldn't afford college, and it came in the form of grants, which don't have to be repaid. States actually funded their higher education system so that tuitions were kept lower. It may be a surprise to everybody in this room that we're actually in a 25-year low in terms of state support for higher education. Today, the federal financial aid system doesn't help young people afford college. It helps them go into debt for college. A generation ago, our nation's premier vehicle for helping low-income students afford college, the Pell Grant, covered about 3/4 of the cost of going to college. Today, it covers about 1/3, which means that most graduates today are leaving with a lot of debt, about $19,000 on average. That's more than double what it was back in the early 1990s, and to compare it to what it was in the late 1970s, you can't compare it. It's apples and oranges. Even community college students, which are supposed to be the low-cost alternative, are leaving with lots of debt, about $6,000 in debt. Now, as we've recently learned from all of the scandals unfolding in a different sector of the financial market, the student loan market, the debt for diploma system, as I call it, is riddled with lots of problems. Conflicts of interest between the lenders. The whole system is now stacked toward making it profitable for the student lenders and hoping maybe students get some help along the way. Now, not only is this bad for the young people who either forgo college altogether because they can't afford it and can't get their hands on enough cash, grants, and loans to pay the bill, and it strangles young people with way too much debt when they start out. It's also put us behind in terms of international competitiveness. Let me give you an example. Among older adults, those currently between the ages of 55 and 64, the US has the highest percentage of college degree holders among all countries in the OECD. If you look at college attainment among those who are currently 25 to 34, the United States falls to number 8. So under conservative rule, essentially, government has taken a back seat when it comes to creating opportunities. We've outsourced this job, thinking that the free market's going to make opportunity happen. And as a result, we've lost enormous amounts of potential. We are falling behind other nations in terms of educational achievement, and we're leaving a lot of young people with more student loan debt than what their parents put down to buy their first home. Now I want to end on another note about what conservatism, particularly the reign of conservatism over the last 3 decades has meant. Because this is not what's captured by labor stats or data. You know, socialized under a steady rhetoric, or a steady diet of conservative rhetoric, government's the problem, the free market's gonna solve all of our issues and create more opportunity than you could ever dream of. Growing up under that conservative diet, or conservative rhetoric, has resulted in this being the first generation that not only is not going to match or exceed their parents' standard of living, they don't even question that. They don't even think there's anything that could be done to change that. Today's young adults learned at an early age that they have to fend for themselves, so instead of questioning the status quo and the priorities of our nation, they question their own self-reliance. And that, to me, is one of the most damaging consequences of the reign of conservative rule that we've had over the last 2 decades. Thank you.